Hello and welcome. Slices of Life is a series that aims to capture moments and places. The first part of this series is called Flora and is available to watch here on YouTube. There should be a link here in the video and one in the description below. In this video, I'll break down how this project came about and the process of making it. When I think back, a lot of different work indirectly influenced me in taking this direction with this series. The earliest thing I can think of is Conversation with a Cactus by Elise, Florenty and Marcel Türkowsky. I remember seeing this in the video screening space at the Berlinische Galerie when I was visiting in 2017. I think you had to walk through it in order to get to the other exhibitions, and I felt like I could have just stayed there. I was transfixed by this calm, meditative, patient approach that simply portrayed moments as they are instead of always heightening them, which is what I was used to. Up until then, I had really only seen relatively conventional narrative films, and this was my first exposure to a film that rejected that. I've heard producers talk about radical films and that young directors need to be radical, and I always misunderstood that as being bold and provocative, when in fact, you can be radically quiet and sensitive as well. Radical is simply a drastic change or difference. And here on YouTube, I was also influenced by some of Will Darbyshire's videos, and more recently Gawx, I think is how you pronounce that. But his second channel, particularly his videos Morning and Fog, are kind of what kickstarted me into this series. I knew I was going on a trip soon and decided to shoot with intention rather than my usual travel shooting approach of capturing random shit when it appears in front of me. So what was the intention? I wanted to capture moments and places in a very objective way and then present them in a calm, meditative edit, so that you could watch a video from the series and get a feel for the place and get a bit lost in it. Flora ended up being a bit more subjective and instills the dreamy qualities of the region it was shot in, but this came about later in the process. Originally, I wanted to shoot static frames of the scenes I came across in a kind of documentary photography style almost. These were supposed to be living photographs so that you would have a nicely composed frame with some subtle movement in it. And because the frame is so still, suddenly this minimal movement becomes more significant and interesting. So that meant I needed a tripod, camera, and sound recorder. No built-up rig, no crazy equipment, everything lightweight. I shot on a Lumix G80 because I wanted something compact and low risk. I knew I wanted the image to feel a bit more organic and take the edge off that digital sensor, so I went with a Canon FD 50mm and a Simco MT 24mm. They're both cheap prime lenses and give the image a bit more character. The depth of field fall-off particularly stands out to me. This is the gradient between what is in focus and out of focus, as you can see here. I also really like how these lenses flare with these multicolored artifacts shaped by their aperture blades. But my favorite thing about these lenses is how they bloom in the highlights. It again just pushes it in the direction of this kind of vintage, slightly softer look, and is the main thing for me that takes the edge off of that digital sensor. Since I didn't take a zoom lens, the prime lenses forced me to really take time to position myself to frame things carefully. Although I have to say constantly switching between these two lenses was a pain in the hole, especially when you miss a little fleeting moment, but I guess that's why documentary shooters use zoom lenses. You do generally get nicer images out of prime lenses though, so it's kind of a balancing act. I'll tell you what was a real problem though. I very quickly realized dragging around the tripod was not going to work. I really only used it when I had a lot of time to set up a shot and being noticed didn't matter. I mostly shot handheld and tried to keep it as steady as possible, hoping the in-body image stabilization of the camera and stabilization in post would save me. Luckily, that kind of worked out. It wasn't so much an issue for the shots used in Flora, but if you want to shoot people in a candid way, a tripod is such a hindrance. I mean, anything that makes you stand out is a hindrance. So as you can tell, I didn't exactly stick to my plan and rules, but sometimes you have to improvise. I also wanted some location sound that wasn't coming from the camera I was using because it was unusable. So I used an old Zoom H1 handy recorder to get some sounds for the edit. Light, compact, and not a tragedy if it had gotten crushed or soaked. Speaking of location, Flora was almost exclusively shot in Ninh Binh in northern Vietnam. I went there on one of these tourist trips from Hanoi, which was intense. I think it would have been a better choice to somehow get there and then rent a bike or moped to move around freely. In any case, I tried to shoot around the herd of tourists I had become a part of in order to capture the beauty of the region. So although the final piece is calm and meditative, the process of shooting it was not. I knew how I wanted to capture scenes, but at the time of shooting, I didn't yet know exactly what scenes I wanted to capture. Makes sense, you need to see what moments jump at you when you're in them. The problem with that is, in the edit, I had lots of footage and no clear plan of what to do with it. So I basically just started picking shots I liked that fit together well. This was easy for Flora because most of these shots were done on the same day in the same region. Naturally, they fit together well. I noticed editing the other parts of this series is a bit more challenging. It takes me a bit of time while editing to figure out what the theme is of what I'm putting together, but once you have it, it becomes much easier to decide what should be removed and included. I mostly shoot narrative projects, so I find this unstructured, documentary-style approach to editing quite difficult. I usually shoot for the edit, knowing almost exactly where each shot will be in the edit. Obviously, there are countless changes, but it's very different to creating a structure from chaos. So respect to all you documentary editors out there. In terms of grading, I wanted a subtle, warm film emulation look. So in DaVinci Resolve, after basic color correction, I added halation, film grain, film damage, and a blur vignette. The halation is a little bit exaggerated, but it added to the dreamy atmosphere of the video, so I left it as is. So a big part of this project is also the music and sound, although originally I hadn't decided whether I would use music or not, as I thought it might distract from experiencing the places depicted in the video. Maybe the other videos will be different, but I think if the soundscape isn't rich and a direct field recording of the visual, it's not as effective at portraying the place that's being recorded. So in this case, I think the music emphasizes another aspect of the footage and places. I composed the music for this project in Logic Pro. Somewhere in the middle of the editing process, I started to realize that an ethereal soundtrack would fit quite well. So I decided to go for a soft, ambient sound. Some songs that influenced me were Suso Sáiz's Looking You in Silence and Max Richter's Psychogeography. I knew I wanted just a few chords and everything to be very slow and simple to directly mirror the visual journey of the video. It's in the key of B minor, and the other chords are just slight variations of a B minor chord voicing. This was all done by ear and messing around on the keyboard, by the way. Originally I thought maybe synth bells would work, but then found that these soft synth pads were more suiting, so I had the chords played at different octaves on 3 separate tracks, so it's roughly divided into high, mid, and low. Then at a certain point I wanted this soaring sound to feel a bit as though you're tearing through the sky. This is a different preset that's more of a lead than a pad, so that it can cut through. At the end there's also a synth that's like a wind texture that pans to create a bit more dimension. The other synths aren't panned, and the chord playing synths all stem from the same preset so that they all feel nicely glued together and cohesive. On top of that, I increased the release, delay, and reverb on all of the presets or plugins to make it kind of bleed together and sound full. It's a simple composition, but it adds a lot to the video, I think. In terms of sound, unfortunately, my field recordings weren't really sufficient, so I downloaded some sounds from a really extensive library of field recordings by free-to-use sounds. I bought it through Bandcamp. You pay once and get access to this huge library and can download what you need. Not a sponsor, but I'll link to it in the description. This basically allowed me to fill in some parts where I just didn't have the right sound to accompany a visual section. It helped that they even have sounds from some of the regions I was in. But overall, the soundscape is calm and realistic. Nothing crazy, and it gets buried anyway once the music really gets going. It's just to add another layer and give a better feel for the places. I realize this project isn't exactly what I had originally conceived, but instead a product of process. I didn't fully remove myself from heightening scenes by adding elements like music, but I'm still pleased with the direction it took. A lot of creative pursuits find their way in doing rather than planning. I've talked to a lot of artists who begin work before knowing what it is they're working on. I generally have some idea before I start, but improvisation and flexibility are undoubtedly essential abilities in any creative pursuit. That's all for this breakdown. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.